Sir, the reporting party has been informed that the activity observed does not constitute any violation of any county ordinance.
That's what my son said to me, in uniform, with his body camera rolling, on the driveway where he took his first steps. He was responding to a police call made by the HOA president, a woman who had spent 2 years trying to find me, inspect me, and annex my property into her homeowners association. A property I'd owned for 21 years. A property that was never part of the HOA. A property where my late wife planted flowers that the HOA's landscaping crew destroyed. And now the responding officer, the one Deborah expected to escort me into compliance, was the kid who grew up in my house and calls me Dad. Stay right here. This one has receipts, trail cameras, and a courtroom moment you won't see coming. My name is Jack Wilder. I'm 53 years old, and I've lived in the same house on Creekstone Lane in Central Virginia for 21 years. I bought the property in 2005, back when the land out here was horse farms and 2-lane roads, and the nearest grocery store was a 30-minute drive into town. The house sits on 2.5 acres at the end of a cul-de-sac, bordered on 3 sides by mature oaks and a seasonal creek that runs cold and clear every spring. When I bought the property, there was no HOA. The developer, a man named Phil Garrity, had subdivided 60 acres into 22 residential lots, filed the plat, and sold them individually without restrictive covenants. It was one of the reasons I chose the lot. I'd spent 20 years in the Army, infantry, then logistics, then a desk job at the Pentagon that made me miss the infantry, and the last thing I wanted in retirement was someone telling me what color to paint my mailbox. I built the house myself over 18 months. Timber frame, metal roof, wraparound porch, detached workshop. I did the electrical and the plumbing with licensed help, but the framing, the siding, the stonework on the chimney, that was all me. When I hammered the last piece of porch railing into place, I stood back and looked at it the way a man looks at something he built with his own hands, and knows will outlast him. In 2012, a second developer bought the remaining undeveloped lots on the eastern half of the original subdivision, and built 34 new homes, cookie-cutter colonials with vinyl siding and 2-car garages, packed onto half-acre lots with shared drainage easements. That developer created the Ashwood Glen Homeowners Association. Every new home was automatically enrolled. The original 22 lots, including mine, were not. We predated the HOA. We had no covenants. We were never members. But Deborah Scanlon didn't see it that way. Deborah moved into Ashwood Glen in 2014. By 2016, she was on the HOA board. By 2018, she was president. She was a retired school administrator, the kind of person who had spent 30 years enforcing dress codes and hall passes, and had simply transferred that energy onto a subdivision. She had short, silver hair, reading glasses on a chain, and a voice that could cut through a leaf blower at 50 yards. In 2019, Deborah launched what she called the Community Unification Initiative. The goal was to absorb the original 22 lots into the HOA's governing structure. She sent letters. She attended county supervisor meetings. She hired an attorney to draft an amended declaration of covenants that would extend the HOA's jurisdiction to the entire subdivision, including homes like mine that had never been part of it. Most of the original homeowners ignored her. A few signed voluntarily because they liked the idea of shared snow removal. I did not sign. I wrote a polite letter declining and included a copy of my deed, which contained no HOA reference whatsoever. Deborah responded with a second letter, then a third. I stopped responding. My son Marcus was 20 at the time, finishing up criminal justice at Virginia Commonwealth. He'd grown up in that house. He learned to throw a football in the front yard, built his first campfire in the back, and carved his initials into the oak tree near the creek when he was 9. That house was his childhood. And now, a woman with a clipboard was trying to tell me it belonged to her jurisdiction. The first real trouble started in the spring of 2023, 4 years after I'd declined to join. By then, Deborah had managed to absorb 11 of the original 22 lots through a combination of persuasion, social pressure, and what I can only describe as bureaucratic exhaustion. She simply wore people down until signing felt easier than fighting. But 11 holdouts remained. And I was the most visible one. I was the most visible because my property sat at the entrance to the cul-de-sac, right where the original lots met the newer section. Every homeowner in Ashwood Glen drove past my house on the way to work, and my house didn't look like theirs. It looked like a house that had been built by a man who knew what he wanted and didn't care what a committee thought about it. The timber frame was dark walnut stain. The metal roof was forest green. The porch had Adirondack chairs and a flagpole with an American flag and a 101st Airborne Division banner beneath it. The workshop had a hand-carved sign that read, "Wilder Woodworks," because I'd taken up furniture making in retirement. Deborah's first move was the Architectural Review Committee. She created one in early 2023, staffed it with 3 board members, and announced in the HOA newsletter that all properties within the Ashwood Glen community boundaries would be subject to periodic exterior reviews. The first round of review letters went out in March, and one landed in my mailbox. The letter cited 4 violations: non-approved exterior stain color, non-conforming roofing material, unauthorized outbuilding, my workshop, and a flagpole exceeding the approved height of 15 feet. Mine was 20. The letter demanded correction within 45 days and noted that fines of $150 per week would accrue after the deadline. I read that letter standing at my mailbox, with the sun on my face and the smell of fresh-cut oak drifting from my workshop, and I felt something I hadn't felt since my last deployment, the particular calm that comes right before a long fight. I didn't call Deborah. I called a property attorney named Frank Ellison, a man I'd known since my Pentagon days. Frank was retired Army JAG, now in private practice in Richmond, and he had the kind of legal mind that could dismantle an argument the way a watchmaker disassembles a clock, piece by piece, in silence, and without losing a single spring. Frank reviewed my deed, the original subdivision plat, and the HOA's amended declaration. His conclusion was immediate and absolute. My property was never part of the HOA. The amended declaration applied only to lots that had voluntarily opted in or were created after the HOA's formation. My lot predated the HOA by 7 years. The architectural review had no jurisdiction over my house, my workshop, my roof, my stain, or my flagpole. Frank drafted a response letter, 4 pages, polite, precise, and devastating. He cited the Virginia Property Owners Association Act, the original plat filing, the absence of any recorded covenant on my deed, and 3 Virginia Supreme Court cases establishing that an HOA cannot unilaterally extend its authority to non-member properties. The letter concluded with a demand that the HOA retract the violations, cease all correspondence regarding my property, and confirm in writing that my lot was not subject to HOA governance. I sent it certified mail on a Monday morning. The return receipt came back signed by Deborah Scanlon herself. 2 weeks later, I received a response, not from Deborah, but from the HOA's attorney, a man named Ross Kendrick, who operated out of a shared office suite near the courthouse. His letter acknowledged that my property may not be formally enrolled in the association, but argued that because I benefited from community services including road maintenance, street lighting, and stormwater management, I had an implied obligation to comply with community standards. Frank read that letter and called me laughing. He said, "Jack, the county maintains those roads. The county pays for those streetlights. The HOA's stormwater system drains into your creek without an easement. If anything, they owe you." He added the letter to our file and told me to sit tight. I sat tight. I stained a rocking chair in the workshop that afternoon, black walnut, hand-rubbed oil finish, and set it on the porch next to the others. From that chair, I could see the entrance to Ashwood Glen, the row of identical mailboxes, and Deborah's house at the top of the hill, where a light burned in her office window until well after 10 every night. She was planning something. I could feel it, the way you feel a storm system moving in before the clouds arrive. By June, Deborah had shifted from official letters to social warfare. She couldn't find me, so she decided to isolate me. The Ashwood Glen Facebook group had 412 members. Deborah posted in it the way some people breathe, constantly, reflexively, and without any apparent awareness that she was doing it. In June alone, she posted 9 times about what she called non-conforming properties. She never used my name, but she didn't have to. Everyone knew which house she was talking about. One post featured a photo of my workshop taken from the street, captioned, Is this the image we want visitors to see when they enter our community? Ashwood Glen deserves a unified standard of appearance. Another showed my flagpole, the American flag, the airborne banner, with the caption, "Height restrictions exist for a reason. No one is above the rules." The comments were split. Some people agreed with Deborah. Some called the posts petty. A few pointed out that my house was one of the most well-maintained properties in the area. But the loudest voices were Deborah's allies, a core group of about 15 homeowners who commented on every post, with the enthusiasm of people who had finally found a cause worth their outrage. One woman named Pam wrote, "That workshop looks like a barn. This isn't a farm." A man named Doug posted, "If he doesn't want to follow the rules, he should move somewhere that doesn't have them." Another person, anonymous of course, wrote, "People who refuse to join the HOA are freeloaders. They use our roads, our lights, and our drainage, and they contribute nothing." I found out about the posts from my neighbor, Ray Castillo. Ray lived 2 houses down, on one of the original lots. He hadn't joined the HOA either. Ray was a retired electrician in his 60s, quiet and methodical, the kind of man who diagnosed problems by listening. He showed me the posts on his phone one evening, while we sat on my porch drinking coffee. I read them all without saying a word. Then I put Ray's phone down on the armrest and looked out at the creek. The fireflies were starting up in the tree line, blinking in slow, random patterns like a code I couldn't quite crack. "You going to respond?" Ray asked. "No," I said. "Good," he said. "Let her run." But Deborah didn't just run. She escalated. In late June, the HOA's landscaping contractor, a company called Green Edge that maintained the common areas, sent a crew to mow the strip of grass between my property line and the street. Except they didn't stop at the strip. They mowed 12 feet into my yard, took out a row of black-eyed Susans my late wife had planted along the driveway, and trimmed 2 low-hanging branches off the oak tree near my mailbox. I came home from a woodworking supply run and found fresh mowing lines cutting across my front yard, like someone had drawn a boundary with a lawnmower. The black-eyed Susans were mulched. The oak branches were piled at the curb. I stood there for a long time, looking at the cut flowers. My wife, Linda, had planted them the year before she died. Breast cancer, 2020. She had put them in the ground on a Saturday in April, wearing gardening gloves and a wide-brimmed hat, and she'd said, "These will come back every year. You won't have to do a thing." She was right. They came back every year, until a landscaping crew hired by Deborah Scanlon mowed them into the dirt. I didn't yell. I didn't drive to Deborah's house. I walked into my workshop, closed the door, and stood at my workbench with my hands flat on the wood until the shaking stopped. Then I took photos. Every cut, every branch, every destroyed flower. I measured the mowing intrusion, 12 feet 4 inches past my property line. I pulled up the Green Edge truck's tire tracks and photographed those too. Then I called Frank Ellison and said, "It's time to start building a file." July brought the county complaints, 14 of them over 3 weeks, all filed by Deborah Scanlon or HOA board members acting at her direction. The first was a noise complaint, alleging that my workshop produced industrial-level sound disturbances. I run a table saw, a planer, and a router, all during legal hours, all within county noise ordinances. An inspector came out, measured the decibels from the property line, and closed the case the same day. The second was a zoning complaint, alleging that I was operating a commercial business, Wilder Woodworks, in a residential zone. I sell furniture at craft fairs twice a year. The county reviewed my activity and classified it as a home-based hobby, which requires no permit in our jurisdiction. Case closed. Then came the building inspection request, an allegation that my workshop was an unpermitted structure posing safety hazards. The inspector found my original building permit from 2007, confirmed the structure met code, and noted in his report that the workshop was in excellent condition, well organized, and clearly maintained by someone with construction experience. After that, a stormwater complaint alleging my property was causing drainage problems for downhill homes. The county engineer reviewed the topography and found that the HOA's own drainage system, installed without an easement, was discharging into the creek on my property, not the other way around. The engineer flagged the HOA for a potential violation, then a fire safety complaint about my chimney. The fire marshal inspected it and found it clean, properly lined, and up to code. He told me it was one of the better-maintained chimneys he'd seen in the county. Then a complaint about my flagpole being a wind hazard. The county had no regulation on residential flagpole height. Dismissed. Then a complaint about excessive outdoor storage, referring to a cord of firewood stacked neatly along the side of my workshop, covered with a tarp. Legal. Tidy. Dismissed. 14 complaints, 14 inspections, 14 clean results. Each one took time. My time. I had to be home for each inspector. I had to provide documents, answer questions, open doors. Each complaint was a small theft of my peace, my afternoon, my quiet retirement. And that was the point. Deborah wasn't trying to find a real violation. She was trying to exhaust me. I documented every one. Dates, inspector names, case numbers, results. Frank added them to the file, which was now thick enough to fill a 3-ring binder. But it was complaint number 14 that changed everything. The 14th complaint was filed with the county's code enforcement office. It alleged that I was maintaining an unauthorized residential structure in violation of community standards, and requested a formal review of my property's compliance status. The complaint was signed by Deborah Scanlon and co-signed by 3 board members. The language was almost identical to a petition for involuntary annexation, a legal mechanism that, in very narrow circumstances, could allow a homeowners association to extend its authority over adjacent properties. It was a Hail Mary. It had almost no chance of succeeding, but the filing itself would create a public record, cloud my property's status, and force me into a legal proceeding that could take months to resolve. Frank called me that evening. His voice was different, not amused anymore, but focused. He said, "Jack, she's not just harassing you. She's trying to create a paper trail that makes it look like your property has always been in dispute. She's building a narrative for a court that doesn't exist yet." I asked him what we should do. He said, "We stop playing defense." That night I sat on the porch and listened to the creek. The air was thick with the sound of cicadas and the distant hum of a neighbor's air conditioner. I looked at the flagpole. The airborne banner hung limp in the still air, and I made a decision I'd been putting off for months. I was going to make this public. Every complaint, every letter, every mowed flower, all of it. Here's what Deborah Scanlon didn't know, the piece of information that, once you understand it, reframes everything. My son, Marcus Wilder, had graduated from the police academy in 2022 and been assigned to the county patrol division. He covered a beat that included the western half of the county, rural roads, small subdivisions, a few commercial strips near the highway. Ashwood Glen was not in his regular patrol zone, but county deputies rotated shifts and covered for each other regularly, especially on weekends. Marcus knew about the HOA situation. Not all of it. I hadn't shown him the full file. But he knew Deborah had been sending letters. He knew about the Facebook posts. He knew about the landscaping crew and the black-eyed Susans. One evening, sitting on the porch where he'd grown up, he'd looked at the empty flower bed and said, "Mom planted those." I said, "I know." He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "The right thing, slowly." Marcus was careful about his role. He understood boundaries. He never once suggested using his badge to intervene. He never ran plates or looked up records. He kept his professional life separate from my dispute with Deborah, the way I'd taught him to keep his emotions separate from his decisions. A lesson I'd learned in the Army and passed down the only way you can, by example. But Deborah didn't know any of this. She didn't know I had a son. She didn't know he was a deputy. She had never asked a single personal question about me. Not where I'd served, not what I did for work, not who lived in my house. To her, I was a problem to be solved, a property to be absorbed, a line on a spreadsheet that wouldn't cooperate. She had no idea that the next time she called the police on me, the county dispatcher might send the one officer in the entire department who had grown up in the house she was complaining about, who had carved his initials in the oak tree she wanted trimmed, who had learned to ride a bike on the driveway she wanted repaved to HOA specifications. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I wasn't counting on it. I was building a case the old-fashioned way: documents, witnesses, and the truth. If Marcus never showed up at my door in uniform, the outcome would be the same. But sometimes the universe has a sense of timing that no amount of planning can match. August was when I went on offense, methodically, quietly. The way you clear a building, room by room, corner by corner, no wasted movement. First, Frank Ellison filed a formal cease and desist with the Ashwood Glen HOA and Deborah Scanlon personally. The letter was 18 pages. It documented every unauthorized action the HOA had taken against my property. The architectural review letters, the fine threats, the landscaping intrusion, the 14 county complaints, and the attempted involuntary annexation filing. It demanded immediate cessation of all contact, retraction of all complaints, and restitution for the destroyed landscaping, specifically the black-eyed Susans that Linda had planted. Frank valued the property damage at $1,200, which included replacement plants, labor, and what he delicately called sentimental value, which, while not quantifiable in standard terms, is recognized in Virginia property law as a factor in calculating damages related to intentional destruction of personal plantings. Second, I filed a formal complaint with the Virginia Common Interest Community Board, the state agency that oversees HOAs. I documented the unauthorized extension of HOA authority to non-member properties, the collection of implied obligations from homeowners who had never signed a covenant, and the pattern of retaliatory complaints filed with county agencies. The complaint triggered a preliminary review. Third, I contacted 7 of the remaining holdout homeowners, the original lot owners who hadn't joined the HOA. I invited them to my house for a Saturday morning meeting. 6 showed up. Ray Castillo was there. So was a retired nurse named Donna Mackey, a young couple named the Newins, who had bought their lot in 2015, and 2 others who had been getting similar pressure from Deborah. We sat on the porch with coffee, and I laid out the full picture. The letters, the complaints, the landscaping, the annexation attempt. The looks on their faces ranged from anger to exhaustion, to the grim recognition of people who had been fighting the same fight alone. We formed a group, not an HOA, we all laughed at that, but a coordinated defense. Frank agreed to represent us collectively at a discounted rate. Each homeowner documented their own experiences with Deborah's campaign. The file grew. Fourth, I submitted a FOIA request to the county for all complaints filed by the Ashwood Glen HOA or its officers in the previous 2 years. The response came back in 12 days, 31 complaints, 31. Not just against me, against 6 of the original lot owners. Noise, zoning, drainage, appearance, signage. 31 complaints, and not a single one had resulted in a violation. A perfect 0 for 31 record of government-sponsored harassment. Fifth, I asked Ray Castillo's nephew, who worked in commercial property insurance, to pull the HOA's financial filings. They were public record under Virginia law. What he found was interesting. The HOA had spent over $14,000 in legal fees in the past 18 months, all directed at efforts to absorb the original lots. That money came from homeowner dues. Ashwood Glen residents were paying to fund a legal campaign against their own neighbors, and most of them had no idea. Sixth, and this was the part that mattered most, I wrote a letter. Not to Deborah, not to the HOA board. To every homeowner in Ashwood Glen, all 56 households. I introduced myself. I explained that I was a retired Army veteran, a widower, and a 21-year resident of Creekstone Lane. I explained that my property was never part of the HOA. I explained what Deborah had done, the complaints, the fencing, the destroyed flowers, the attempted annexation. I included copies of the FOIA results and the legal spending, and I invited them to a public meeting at the county library, where I would answer any questions and show every document. I mailed the letters on a Wednesday. By Friday evening, my phone had 12 messages from Ashwood Glen homeowners I'd never met, all saying some version of the same thing. We had no idea. Deborah's response to the letters was swift, furious, and exactly what I expected. She called an emergency HOA board meeting for the following Monday evening. She posted in the Facebook group calling my letter a coordinated attack on the community by hostile non-members. She accused me of trying to divide the neighborhood and undermine the democratic governance of Ashwood Glen. She said I was a disgruntled individual with a personal vendetta and urged homeowners to stand together against outside interference. The language was revealing. Outside interference. I'd lived here 7 years before the HOA existed. The interference was hers. Then she did something I hadn't anticipated. She filed a police report. The report alleged that I was engaged in harassment and intimidation of HOA leadership. It cited my cease and desist letter, my FOIA requests, and my letters to homeowners as evidence of a systematic campaign to destabilize community governance. She requested a welfare check on herself, claiming she felt threatened by my correspondence. Frank called me when he found out. He said, "She's trying to reframe this. She wants the police to see you as the aggressor before anyone asks her to explain the 31 complaints." A deputy was dispatched to do the welfare check. Deborah answered her door, showed the deputy the letters, and gave a statement about feeling unsafe. The deputy noted the complaint and left. Standard procedure, no action taken. But it was the police report that set the stage for what happened next. Because Deborah had now established herself as a victim in the county system, and that meant every future call she made would be flagged as a follow-up to an existing case. The dispatcher would see her name, see the history, and send a unit. She had built herself a direct line to law enforcement response. The community meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in late August. I arrived early. Frank was there. Ray and Donna and the Winds were there. The library conference room held 60 seats. By 7 o'clock, 43 of them were full. Homeowners from both the original lots and the newer section. Some I recognized, most I didn't. Deborah walked in at 7:05 with 2 board members and the HOA's attorney, Ross Kendrick. She sat in the front row, center, with her reading glasses on and her manila folder open on her lap. She looked like a woman preparing to preside over a meeting she fully intended to control. I started the presentation, calm, factual, document by document. I showed the original plat. I showed my deed. I showed the HOA's amended declaration and highlighted the section that applied only to voluntarily enrolled or post-formation lots. I showed the 14 complaints against me and their results. I showed the FOIA results. 31 complaints across 6 homeowners, 0 violations. I showed the HOA's legal spending, $14,000 of homeowner dues used to pursue a campaign against neighbors who had never been members. When I showed the photo of the black-eyed Susans, before and after, a woman in the 3rd row put her hand over her mouth. I told them my wife had planted those flowers the year before she died. I told them a landscaping crew hired by the HOA had destroyed them without my knowledge or consent. The room was quiet. Then I showed the financial analysis. I showed that the HOA had been allocating a portion of annual dues to a line item called Community Boundary Expansion, a fund specifically created to finance the legal absorption of non-member properties. Homeowners had been paying for this without knowing what it was. A man in the back, a newer resident named Greg, stood up and said, "Are you telling me my dues have been paying to sue my own neighbors?" I said, "That's what the records show." The murmuring in the room turned into something louder. Deborah stood up. She turned to face the room and said, with the full authority of someone who had been in charge for 6 years, "This man is trying to manipulate you. Everything I've done has been for the good of this community. He refuses to follow the rules that everyone else follows." Ray Castillo, who had been sitting quietly in the 2nd row, stood up. "Deborah," he said, in a voice so even it could have leveled concrete, "those rules don't apply to us. They never did. You know that." The meeting lasted another 90 minutes. Questions were asked. Documents were examined. 3 homeowners demanded an emergency audit of HOA finances. Deborah left before the meeting ended, flanked by her board members, her manila folder closed and pressed tight against her chest. The Saturday after the meeting was when Deborah made her final move, the one that brought it all together in a way no one could have scripted. I was in my front yard around 10 in the morning, loading a handmade rocking chair into the bed of my truck. I'd finished it that week, quarter-sawn white oak, hand-cut joints, a gentle curve in the seat that took me 3 attempts to get right. It was headed for a craft fair in Charlottesville. A police cruiser turned onto Creekstone Lane. I didn't think much of it at first. Deputies patrolled the area regularly, especially on weekends when the neighborhood had more foot traffic. But the cruiser slowed as it passed the entrance to Ashwood Glen, then turned into the cul-de-sac and pulled into my driveway. The door opened. The officer stepped out, and I felt my chest tighten, not from fear, but from the sheer improbable geometry of the moment. It was Marcus. My son was in full uniform, duty belt, body camera, badge catching the morning sun. He walked toward me with the professional posture of a man responding to a call, but his eyes told a different story. His eyes said, "Dad, I know." "Mr. Wilder," he said, using my last name the way he'd been trained. "I've been dispatched to this address on a disturbance complaint. The reporting party alleges that you are conducting unauthorized commercial activity on your property." I looked past him. At the curb, parked in her silver Lexus with the window down and her phone in her hand, was Deborah Scanlon. She had called the police because I was loading a rocking chair into my truck. Marcus followed protocol. He asked me to describe what I was doing. I told him I was transporting a piece of handmade furniture to a craft fair. He asked if I operated a business from my home. I said I was a hobbyist woodworker, which the county had already confirmed during a previous inspection. He asked if I had documentation. I said I did. The county's own ruling was in a folder in my workshop. Then Marcus did something that was entirely by the book, but felt, in the moment, like the quiet turning of a key. He walked over to Deborah's car. I couldn't hear the conversation from where I stood, but I watched it unfold. Marcus stood at her window with his notepad open, his body camera recording. Deborah was animated, gesturing toward my house, toward the truck, toward the workshop. She handed him her manila folder. He opened it, looked through the pages, and handed it back. Then he spoke. I could see his lips moving. Deborah's expression changed. The animation drained from her face, replaced by something rigid and uncertain. She said something back, a question from the way her chin tilted. Marcus answered. He was calm, measured, the way I'd taught him to be. He walked back to me. "Sir," he said, still in his professional voice, but with the faintest crack at the corner of his mouth. "The reporting party has been informed that the activity observed does not constitute a violation of any county ordinance. I've advised her that filing repeated complaints without basis may constitute misuse of emergency services under Virginia Code Section 18.2-461. I nodded. "Thank you, Deputy." He nodded back. Then, so quietly that only I could hear, he said, "Nice chair, Dad." He got back in his cruiser, pulled out of my driveway, and drove down Creekstone Lane. As he passed Deborah's car, she was still sitting there, both hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead with the expression of a woman who had just learned something she couldn't process. It took her 20 minutes to leave. I found out later what Marcus had told her. He'd informed her that the county had already investigated her commercial activity complaint and found it baseless. He'd told her that her name appeared in the dispatch system in connection with multiple previous complaints against this address, none of which had resulted in enforcement action. And he'd told her, calmly, professionally, as a matter of factual disclosure, that the homeowner at this address was his father. He didn't say it as a threat, he said it as information. The same way you'd tell someone the road they're driving on leads to a dead end. Not to stop them, just so they know. Deborah now knew 3 things she hadn't known before. The responding officer was my son. The police were aware of her pattern of complaints, and the next call she made would be scrutinized under a microscope. She didn't call again. The week after Marcus's visit was when the walls closed in on Deborah from every direction. The story of the community meeting had spread. Homeowners talked. The FOIA results were shared in a private group chat that someone had started as an alternative to the official HOA Facebook page. Within days, the alternative group had 230 members, more than half the HOA's roster. People were angry, not at me, at the woman who had been spending their money to harass their neighbors. On Monday, a formal petition was submitted to the HOA board, demanding an emergency general meeting and a full financial audit. The petition had 41 signatures, well over the 30% required by the bylaws. The board had no choice but to schedule it. On Tuesday, the Virginia Common Interest Community Board notified the HOA that my complaint had been escalated to a formal investigation. An auditor would be reviewing the HOA's financial records, meeting minutes, and governance procedures within 30 days. On Wednesday, Frank Ellison filed the civil complaint we'd been building for months. The lawsuit named the Ashwood Glen HOA and Deborah Scanlon personally as defendants. The claims included trespass, the landscaping intrusion, harassment through repeated baseless complaints, intentional destruction of personal property, the Black-Eyed Susans, and abuse of process through the attempted involuntary annexation filing. The lawsuit also included claims on behalf of the 6 other original lot owners who had been subjected to Deborah's complaint campaign. Total damages sought, $85,000. The emergency HOA meeting was held on Thursday evening at the community clubhouse. I wasn't there. It was an internal HOA matter, and I had no standing to attend. But Donna Mackey's daughter lived in Ashwood Glen and gave us a full account. The meeting was chaos. 47 homeowners showed up, the largest attendance in the HOA's history. Deborah tried to chair the meeting, but was challenged immediately by a motion to replace her as presiding officer. The motion passed, 31-16. A retired CPA named Howard Brennan was elected temporary chair. Howard opened the financial records. What he found was worse than what I'd presented at the library. The Community Boundary Expansion Fund had received $18,000 over 3 years. But there were additional expenditures, attorney fees, landscaping corrections on non-member properties, and a line item for compliance enforcement materials that included the cost of printing violation letters, architectural review notices, and laminated signs. The total spent on the campaign against the original homeowners was over $26,000. $26,000 of homeowner dues spent trying to take control of properties that had never been part of the HOA. A woman named Catherine, who had lived in Ashwood Glen since 2013, stood up and said something that, according to Donna's daughter, silenced the room. "Deborah, I moved here because I thought the HOA protected us. Instead, you used our money to bully a veteran who just wanted to be left alone on the land his wife loved. I'm ashamed I ever voted for you." The room voted, 38-9. Deborah Scanlon was removed as president of the Ashwood Glen Homeowners Association, effective immediately. But the climax, the part that pulled everything into focus, happened 2 days later. On Saturday morning, I was on the porch sanding a piece of cherry wood for a side table when a car pulled into my driveway. It was a silver Lexus, Deborah's car. She got out slowly. She wasn't carrying a manila folder. She wasn't wearing her reading glasses on a chain. She looked smaller than I remembered, shorter, thinner, diminished in the way people look when the scaffolding of their authority has been removed and they're standing on their own 2 feet for the first time in years. She walked to the bottom of my porch steps and stopped. "Mr. Wilder," she said, "I owe you an apology." I set the sandpaper down. I didn't say anything. I just listened. She said she was sorry about the flowers. She said she hadn't known Linda had planted them. She said she hadn't known about Marcus until he showed up in uniform. She said she had been so focused on building a unified community that she had stopped seeing the people in it. I looked at her for a long time. The morning light was coming through the oaks, dappling the porch in shifting patterns of gold and shadow. The creek was running. A cardinal was calling from the tree line. I said, "Deborah, you didn't need to unify anything. You just needed to knock on the door." She nodded. She turned around. She drove away. I picked up the sandpaper and went back to work. The cherry wood was smooth under my hands, warm from the sun, and smelling the way good wood always smells, like something living, something patient, something that remembers being a tree. The aftermath moved with the steady, unglamorous efficiency of consequences catching up to decisions. The civil case settled in November. The HOA's insurance carrier paid $53,000 to the original homeowners group, a portion to each of the 7 plaintiffs, weighted by the severity of the harassment each had endured. Deborah personally paid an additional $4,800 in damages related to the landscaping destruction, including the cost of replanting the black-eyed Susans with the same variety Linda had chosen, Rudbeckia hirta, the kind with the dark centers and the petals like small suns. The Virginia Common Interest Community Board completed its investigation in January. The HOA was found to have violated multiple provisions of the Virginia Property Owners Association Act, including improper extension of authority, failure to disclose financial allocations, and collection of assessments under false pretenses. The board issued a formal reprimand and required the HOA to amend its governing documents, provide refunds for the Community Boundary Expansion Fund, and undergo annual compliance audits for 3 years. Deborah was not charged criminally, but the county attorney's office issued a formal warning regarding the misuse of government complaint systems. Frank told me the warning was one more filing away from a misdemeanor charge for abuse of process. It was enough. Deborah got the message. The Ashwood Glen HOA elected a new board in February. Howard Brennan, the retired CPA, became president. His first act was to send a letter to every original lot owner, including me, formally acknowledging that our properties were not and had never been subject to HOA governance. The letter was one page. It was clear. It was the letter Deborah should have written 6 years ago. Howard also reached out to me about the stormwater drainage issue. The HOA's system had been discharging onto my property without an easement for over a decade. We worked out an agreement. The HOA would install a proper drainage redirect at their expense and pay a nominal annual easement fee for the portion of my creek that served as the watershed outlet. It was fair. It was neighborly. It was what reasonable people do. Marcus got promoted to corporal that spring. He transferred to the investigations division, property crimes and fraud, ironically. He never mentioned the incident with Deborah again, except once. We were fishing in the creek behind the house on a Sunday afternoon in April, the dogwoods blooming white against the green hillside, and he said, "You know, when dispatch sent me to your address, I almost called in and asked for a reassignment." "Why didn't you?" I asked. He reeled in his line and cast again, the fly landing soft on the water. "Because you taught me that doing the right thing and the easy thing are almost never the same thing." I didn't say anything. I just watched the line drift downstream, the water catching the light, the current carrying everything forward the way it always does. That summer, the black-eyed Susans came back. Not the replanted ones. Those were still small, still finding their roots. The originals. 3 of them, growing from the edge of the flower bed where the landscaping crew had missed them. Somehow they'd survived the mowing, pushed through the compacted soil, and bloomed exactly where Linda had planted them. I sat on the porch that evening with a cup of coffee, watching those 3 yellow flowers bob in the breeze, and I thought about what Linda would have said about all of it. She would have said what she always said when I got wound up about something. "Jack, the flowers come back. Everything else is just weather." She was right. She usually was.
What's